I think with that, you've really got to remember that you're a great applicant, and the fact that you're not getting stuff might not be because of you. It might be because of these systems which aren't designed with you in mind. So you really have to kind of stand tall in who you are and really believe that your neurodivergency is a strength, it's not a weakness.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Student Lawyer Podcast series. Whether you're at school, sixth form, university, thinking about a career in law, or exploring law careers, you're in the right place. We are the one-stop shop for student lawyers. If you'd like to join the Student Lawyer as a writer, please email hello@thestudentLawyer.com. This episode is sponsored by the University of Law. What really sets the University of Law apart from other universities is its belief that its students should learn in a realistic, professional and contemporary context. They focus exclusively on practice-based training and give students access to their extensive career service and jobs vacancy database as soon as they accept a place with them. Through the University of Law's Pro Bono programme, law students can hone their skills by working on real cases before they graduate. The University of Law offers a range of postgraduate legal training and master's degrees designed by qualified experts to help students advance at any stage of their career. Their courses are employment-focused, honing key skills in a teaching environment based on real legal practice. Part-time and online study options are also available on many of their courses to help students work and study at the same time. To find out more about the courses on offer, click the link in the description box of the podcast. Stephanie, what is one of the biggest challenges that you face when writing law essays at university?
Well, Camilla, it takes such a long time to gain a deep understanding of the area of law I'm focusing on and to work out what the key arguments are in order to critically analyse the topic. It often involves spending countless hours reading lots of books. I just wish there was a simpler way.
It's funny you say that because our awesome sponsor, Bloomsbury Publishing, has a book series called Great Debates in Law, which explores the key debates and controversies in different areas of the law, all written by experts in their field.
That sounds perfect. Where can I find out more about this book series?
Head over to bloomsbury.com, and for limited time only, they are offering listeners of the podcast 20% off any book in the series by using the code GreatDebates20, and you can find the details in the description box of the podcast. Welcome to the Student Lawyer Podcast series. My name's Camilla and I'm a future trainee solicitor and current LPC student at the University of Law. Today, we're delighted to be joined on the show by Amelia Platton, who is founder of the Neurodiverse Lawyer Project, winner of the Legal Cheek Award 2022 for Best Use of Social Media. And in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the Neurodiverse Lawyer Project, why Amelia set it up, hopefully providing some general tips for neurodiverse students, as well as shining a light on neurodiversity. So without further ado, let's welcome Amelia onto the show. Thank you so much for joining us, Amelia. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me on.
No, not at all. It's really great to have you here, and congratulations on your recent win. I know I just mentioned it in the introduction, but really congratulations for the Legal Cheek Award.
Thank you. It came as quite a surprise actually, because there's so many other amazing people nominated, but I'm really thankful to be put up for the win. So yeah.
Huge congratulations. Okay, so before we get started with the episode, I thought perhaps you could start by introducing yourself and explaining a bit about where you currently are in terms of your legal career.
Yeah, so hi everyone, thank you for having me. So like Camilla said, my name is Amelia, I'm 23, proud Northerner, don't know if that's important, feels like it is. Last September I graduated from the University of Leeds with a first class law degree. I also did a placement year at a law firm between my penultimate and final year. After having, I guess what you would describe as some struggles with entering the legal sector, which I'm sure we'll get into later, as a result of the fact that I am autistic and dyspraxic, I set up the Neurodiverse Lawyer Project, and about a month back, I found out that I am a future trainee. So yeah, that's just a little summary of me.
Brilliant. Thank you for going into that, and congratulations on your training contract as well.
Thank you.
So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the Neurodiverse Lawyer Project for anyone who hasn't yet heard about it.
So I set it up as an Instagram talking about my personal experience as a neurodivergent aspiring lawyer after I had faced some discrimination in interviews around 7 months ago. Within a few weeks, it had really picked up traction, and I was getting loads and loads of messages from other neurodivergent people, and a lot of people had faced really similar things that I had, or even worse things. Therefore, I thought I would transition it into something that actively sought to both support and empower neurodivergent lawyers and aspirees, and also encourage firms to change policies and wider culture to better accommodate neurodivergent people, or at the very least, put it on their diversity and inclusion agenda. I now have a team of, I think, over 50 wonderful volunteers who fit under 5 divisions that we have. Our Instagram has over 18,000 followers. We have a podcast, the Neurodiverse Lawyer Podcast, where we interview neurodivergent lawyers about their experiences and firms on their approach. We also have a website and blog where we do a similar thing. And we have a guidebook coming out to support neurodivergent aspiring lawyers that covers literally everything from university to junior employment, and covers topics like mental health, mitigating circumstances, DSA, all the way to things like disclosure applications and reasonable adjustments. We are currently in the process of transitioning into an incorporated charitable organisation, that's a mouthful, where we'll be starting what we're currently terming the NDLP Index, which tracks changes firms are making for neurodivergent inclusion in real terms rather than in corporate speak. It puts all their collaborations with us, so for example, on podcasts and blogs and on the Instagram, in one place. And it also offers specific tips for neurodivergent people wanting to apply to that specific firm. And they can also utilise our Neurodiverse mentoring, which is where our network provides feedback to the firm on their disability inclusion policies. Everything that we do is extremely based on the personal experiences of neurodivergent people at that firm, and also in the wider workplace. We really do like to kind of shy away from, like I said, the corporate speak and the tokenism and stuff like that. And it's the first of its kind. So yeah, look out for that. But that's just a kind of a summary of what we do.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for explaining. And I think that the rapid growth that the Neurodiverse Lawyer Project has seen just goes to show how much it was needed.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so I think that's really powerful. And I just wanted to drill down actually into the term neurodiverse.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be able to explain what that exactly means? Because I think that, some people might not know.
So there's kind of 3 main terms that are used in this area, and I think, like you say, a lot of people get confused between them all. So there's neurodiverse, which essentially means the same as neurodiversity, which is essentially the diversity and variation of cognitive functioning in people. So it's essentially about kind of celebrating everyone, because everyone has a unique brain and therefore have different skills, abilities and needs, etc. And it's generally thought of as much wider than neurodivergence. So neurodiverse and neurodiversity can also include neurotypical people, who are people that don't have neurodivergence, which I will get into in a second, because everyone has a unique brain, basically. There's no other way to put it. Compare that with neurodivergent, which is an umbrella term that refers to cognitive functioning, which is not considered typical. So it's a little bit more narrow, but there are quite a lot of conditions within it. So the ones you would think of, like autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, etc. But also things like acquired neurodivergency, Tourette's, BPD, epilepsy, etc. But the main difference is neurodivergent is the correct term for people that have these conditions that a lot of people think of when they say neurodiverse. The reason I use neurodiverse is because I think neurodiversity and celebrating everybody's unique brain is important, but I do advocate predominantly for neurodivergent people, as confusing as that is, but that is a summary. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know the difference between the two. Yeah, so thanks for going into that. And why did you decide to set up the project? I know you kind of touched on this a little bit, but perhaps if you could maybe go into a bit more detail.
Yeah, there's a variety of reasons, really. And probably the main one, when I first started it, there wasn't kind of a calculated reason. It was just because I'd been through an interview process where, again, my reasonable adjustments hadn't been put in, and my feedback related pretty much to my neurodivergent traits. At that time, I only knew I was dyspraxic. I didn't know I was autistic, but nevertheless, it related to that. And I just felt quite lonely. No one really spoke about it that much, especially on the more kind of junior lawyer side. I saw no one like me in senior positions. And it just leads you to think, okay, do neurodivergent people really have a place within the legal sector? And then obviously things like discrimination and I think just wider ignorance around neurodivergency in the sector is quite common. And then, like I said, no one in the social media space, and I just kind of saw a niche and went for it, so to speak. But originally it was much more about just sharing my personal experience and trying to see if anyone else had a similar experience. And it turns out that they did. In terms of kind of wider issue, I think most people are aware nowadays that there is quite a lot of diversity and inclusion gaslighting that goes on. So what I mean by that is firms claiming that they are inclusive when in fact they are not putting in inclusionary processes within the firm. And that applies to recruitment as well, because you see that, you know, they've called themselves inclusive or a great employer for disabled people, and then you get into the assessment centre and they can't put in a basic reasonable adjustment. You start to doubt yourself and you start to just believe that it's your fault when it's not. The wider issue, of course, is figures like 3% of solicitors are disabled, 50% of managers would be uncomfortable hiring someone who is autistic, and I think the general figure is like 27% for people who are wider neurodivergent. 22% of autistic people are in employment. Only 20% of firms have a future diversity and inclusion plan for neurodivergency versus I think it's like 96% for other protected characteristics. And it's just not talked about. I think it's been pushed under the rug, so to speak, for far too long now. And most people just don't realise the extent of the problem. But the figures don't really lie in that regard. And if you want to learn more about that, I would really recommend going to read the Legally Disabled and the Law Society's research on disability in the legal sector, because it sets out a whole lot better than I've just done there. But that is kind of a general summary of why I decided to set it up.
Great. And what I'll do, I'll find links to those resources that you just mentioned, and I'll leave them in the description box of the podcast as well. So if anyone does want to go and read more about that, then they can do so. So what was your experience like when applying for training contracts, and how did your neurodiversity impact your journey?
It was interesting. I think getting a training contract is hard. We all know that. And it's hard enough when you're not grappling with something that is completely misunderstood. Like I said, most of my reasonable adjustments when I went to assessment centres were not put in. And I constantly got kind of like comments like, how do you expect to do this with this condition? Why aren't you looking at me? Why are your eyes over there, etc.? And there's just general ignorance, I think, around neurodivergency and a lot of lack of knowledge, I think, a lot of the time about it. I think there's various parts here that I can't put on the firm, but might have been caused by the wider sector. So, for example, I lacked a lot of confidence because I didn't think firms would want me. So I really tried to hide that part of me. And that really, I think, made my applications quite generic, and it wasn't really me, and I wasn't really selling myself. I was obviously then limited in terms of experience as well, because obviously, being autistic, that you struggle with kind of like the social elements and social communication. It's different. And therefore getting involved in things at university is quite difficult. And then dyspraxia obviously affects kind of my processing, but also my motor movements. And so getting involved in sports and kind of like arts hobbies and stuff like that is all really, really difficult. And so I just had to start kind of creating my own experience and looking for roles which were much more independent. So 2 things that I did was obviously I set up this Instagram, but that was after I graduated. During my degree, I would do things like I was course representative in my final year, which was quite an autonomous role. And also it was all remote, obviously, because it was lockdown. But things like that, I had to look for kind of alternative things. I couldn't just take up everything that was there for me. And then finally, I think it's kind of like the inconsistent goals. So when you're neurodivergent, a lot of the time you will hyper-focus or you'll have a special interest, particularly if you're autistic, on a certain topic. So mine was company law. I got top module prize in company law. It's my favourite topic. But certain other topics like land law, I had no interest in. And it's not so easy when you're neurodivergent to motivate yourself to like certain things and to put in the effort equally across all of your modules. And also there's things like, because I was undiagnosed autistic, it was, my mental health is not great. I'm just going to be candid there. And it meant that often I would have to take kind of like weeks out of university, which now I realise is autistic burnout. But at the time, I didn't know what it was. And so I just thought that would push me down. But the thing is, I did end up with a good variety of experiences. I do feel like I had to work harder than I should have done to achieve that. And I don't think that's necessarily fair. And again, with the training contract process, that all kind of put me a little bit down. It was only when I kind of gathered the confidence through the project and through advocating for myself that I started to pick up confidence to put some of this stuff in the mitigating circumstances box, and really just sell myself as a person, sell my skills and the impact that I've made, rather than just trying to kind of be very generic and write what I thought they wanted and hiding part of myself. So that's gone a little bit away from the question, but yeah, I think it was definitely more difficult than it should have had to have been. But I made it eventually, and I think it's just a process of finding the confidence to go through, unfortunately, at the moment. But I'm really hoping that's going to start to change soon.
Yeah, I think you raised some really important points there, especially around being yourself and how key that is to actually being successful. And then what goes hand in hand with that is confidence. And then the confidence might not be there if people aren't talking about, a diverse range of people, and they're not being represented in the legal industry. So yeah, I think so many important points that you touched on there, and hopefully raising awareness will help to at least create more visibility, hopefully empower more people, and then hopefully have an impact on the wider legal industry. Yeah,
definitely. I think we've got to see the people there. And people have to unfortunately fight for it a little bit, I think, at the moment. And to do that, unfortunately, we've got to have people in those roles who are willing to advocate. And that shouldn't be our responsibility, but I think it kind of is at the moment. It's not our responsibility, but it kind of inadvertently becomes it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think some people just find it easier to speak out if others have done it before.
Yeah, definitely. So I think people are naturally worried in a very competitive space anyway, that if they speak out and say something negative about firms, that they will immediately be looked down upon, and it will, push them to the back of the queue, so to speak, in terms of getting a training contract. But actually, for me, speaking up and standing up for myself was really the only way that I got a training contract. And I think that's unfortunate, because I shouldn't have to do that, but it did work.
And I think that, so my next question is, well, I think I already sort of know the answer to the first part of it, but do you think that law firms are doing enough to embrace those who are neurodivergent during the vacation scheme and training contract application process? Or do you think more could be done? And if so, what do you think could be done by firms?
Yeah, I think you've cracked it on the head. The short answer is no, and that's not even controversial. Most firms are well aware that they need to do more and they're not doing enough at the moment. I think the trouble is that a lot of these processes were not built with neurodivergent people in mind, and they mostly assessed for neurotypical attributes. So what I mean by that is, obviously, I, as an autistic person, have quite a different communication style. And therefore, if I'm being graded on communication based on a criteria that fits around norms of communication, I'm not going to fulfill that. And so you can, firms can advocate for wanting difference, but if they continually recruit the same people, which often they do, it's very difficult to say that. Reasonable adjustments and mitigating circumstances comes some way in circumventing this, but I do think, in my opinion anyway, that it doesn't rid us of all the issues. There's a lot of tokenism, as I've mentioned, that goes on, and disability diversity gaslighting that goes on to ensure that it's not well publicised that there's an issue. But when you see figures and when you see kind of the research that the Law Society and Legally Disabled came out with, it's quite clear. And then even where neurodivergent people do end up kind of slipping through the cracks, so to speak, it involves so much extra work in comparison to a neurotypical person, and it just shouldn't be that way. We really, really need to see firms being proactive, reaching out to people, asking if they need stuff, having expertise so they know more reasonable adjustments than just extra time. Thinking about mitigation. So what I mean by mitigation is, obviously I can ask a firm not to judge me on things like eye contact, redesigning processes to stop excluding us. AI-based techniques are notoriously bad for judging neurodivergent people even, because again, they're often marking on things like whether you don't have gaps in your CV, but also AI-based kind of video interviewing grades again on things like body language, talking speed, eye contact, which is quite difficult, particularly for autistic people. The main thing I think will come down to flexibility and also trusting us when we say we need something. I think, to use kind of a slightly crude analogy, you can't test a fish by its ability to climb a tree, and also not trust it when it say it can't. I think the excuse there is that, neurodivergency is not always visible. I don't like the word invisible because I don't think my traits are invisible. I think you can see them quite clearly. And I think often that's just used as a way to keep neurodivergent people invisible. But a lawyer isn't one thing, and we really need to start seeing a change because they miss out on so many great applicants when they continually exclude us for very small things like, this person didn't look at me during the interview and therefore they're not getting the job. So I think sometimes it's really simple, and some things are a much broader cultural shift. But hopefully we can start to see that happen soon. Things are happening, but just not quite at the pace that I would like yet.
Before we get into the second half of the episode, I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about the sponsors of today's show and the law school that I chose to study my LPC at, and that's the University of Law. The University of Law believes in training students for the real world from the moment they accept a place. Their experienced career service and award-winning pro bono clinics offer students the chance to get real-life experience from the start. They offer a range of postgraduate legal training and master's degrees designed by qualified experts to help students advance at any stage of their career. Their courses are employment-focused, honing key skills in a teaching environment based on real legal practice. Part-time and online study options are also available on many of their courses to help students work and study at the same time. To find out more about the courses on offer, click the link in the description box of the podcast. And so what advice would you give to other aspiring lawyers who are neurodiverse and who are applying for training contracts at the moment?
Yeah, I think the thing with this is no one really tells you how to do it. And it's why I've kind of started to create all these templates online to, ask for reasonable adjustments, to provide feedback, because no one teaches you how to do this kind of thing. And I imagine to a lot of neurotypical people, asking for reasonable adjustments probably does not seem like such a complex thing. But actually, there's a lot to it and it involves quite a lot of confidence to do it. So in terms of tips for getting a training contract, I think the first one is, like I say, be firm. You may have to enforce things. Reasonable adjustments are not always put in or put in correctly. And you may occasionally have to provide feedback to the firm and say things weren't done right. I always think one example that I give people is the fact that I did my assessment centre twice, which is an unusual way of doing things, I appreciate. But essentially what happened was the first time around, my reasonable adjustments weren't put in, and then I sent through some feedback and I was given the opportunity to do it again. And obviously that time I got it. But I wouldn't be where I am if I had not stood up for myself and said, these things weren't put in correctly. I think with that, you've really got to remember that you're a great applicant, and the fact that you're not getting stuff might not be because of you. It might be because of these systems which aren't designed with you in mind. So you really have to kind of stand tall in who you are and really believe that your neurodivergency is a strength, it's not a weakness. I think secondly, then it's just about selling yourself. And again, that comes down to the fact that difference is a benefit. And arguably, in terms of diversity, neurodivergent people are the most diverse in that sense because, my brain is physically different to a neurotypical person. And also, obviously, neurodivergent people are as diverse as neurotypical people, and therefore we all have different experiences in that regard as well. In terms of selling yourself, it's just about showing where you've made a real impact, and that goes to neurotypical people as well. But I think once you kind of pick up on and learn that skill of marking where you've made an impact, it becomes considerably easier to kind of create that, I hate this phrase, but personal brand of, a couple of skills which almost like define you a little bit. And then finally, I think it comes down to what we were talking about before, which is don't be afraid to be yourself. You don't have to follow the same path as everyone else. I've very much created my own. I didn't do a vacation scheme. I didn't really get involved with many societies at uni. I wasn't on any sports teams. I didn't take the standard path, so to speak. And if you look at everyone else as well, they're not all taking the same. And so just trying to kind of fit yourself into that rhetoric as a neurodivergent person, you shouldn't do. It will just kind of erode your confidence and mental health. And so don't be afraid to kind of break away from the crowd and do things in a way that work for you. But as kind of like 3 generic points, that would probably be my advice at the moment.
That's really great advice. I saw one of your recent Instagram posts on how to use neurodivergence as a strength or advantage on training contract applications. Could you maybe go into a bit more detail about that?
Yeah, so a common question that I'm often asked is, can I talk about my neurodivergency? Does it all have to be positive? Will they look down on me, etc.? And like I said, the thing is, no one teaches you how to do this. And it's often extremely daunting to be so transparent about your neurodivergency on applications. So I decided to write a post on that. And I also did a podcast, which kind of mentioned it with another future trainee called Alice on my podcast. So in terms of that, what I often say is, obviously, I can't tell you that firms are not going to look down on neurodivergency because it happens. But I would always say be as transparent as possible. I always see my neurodivergency as a strength. And I think there's various parts of this, which we'll go into in a second. But it doesn't have to be a weakness. It doesn't have to be all about challenges. There are positives to it. But equally, you don't have to, sell yourself sell your soul to the devil, so to speak, and completely go over any of the challenges that you faced. So I think there's a few ways you could do this. Firstly, I think is the obvious one, which is resilience. And so most neurodivergent people will have faced additional hurdles to overcome, from kind of educational hurdles to things in your personal life. You know, as someone with dyspraxia, like, I can find very simple tasks quite difficult, and that will create a certain level of resilience as you go along. And I think that is probably the most common thing that people talk about on applications, is that kind of level of resilience and ability to overcome. And then there's kind of specific abilities, which are directly linked to your neurodivergency. So there's things like hyperfocus, ability to research, special interests, etc., which is quite pertinent for me in my experience, say with company law, like I mentioned. But I think the thing with that is to ensure that you're differentiating yourself from other neurodivergent people who are applying, you really have to ensure that you're linking it into your specific experiences and showing how that has led to you being proactive or led to you solving a problem or something like that. So really make sure that you are tailoring it back to you. And then there's things like learned skills, again, through challenges. So you're probably likely to be quite a good problem solver, because you probably think in a different way, but also because of all those challenges you face, you've probably had to find ways to overcome them. And occasionally, not even occasionally, quite a lot of the time, you may have found a better way of doing stuff for everyone. I know I was chatting to a partner who's coming on my podcast soon, who was talking about how, because he is dyslexic, he checks his work quite a lot more than the average person. And that has actually led his work to be kind of honed as better in terms of attention to detail than a lot of other people's work in his firm. And so I think, you know, there's ways to sell it as something that is a real positive. And then finally, there's things like your motivations. I always talk about how, you know, training contracts are about learning the law and stuff, but it can also be to kind of like push a personal agenda. So I talked about how I wanted to grow my platform and how having a training contract would help with my advocacy. And, you know, you have to be inside an organisation to make change to it often. And also things like the fact that, you know, again, I go into special interest mode on certain topics. And if that relates to law, then that's great. And that's a motivation in and of itself. And then finally, you can do things like personal branding with neurodivergent advocacy as well. So what I mean by that is kind of linking all of your experiences back to either how you've overcome certain challenges or how you've advocated for neurodivergent people in each of your roles. Obviously, that's quite easy for me because this kind of last 7 months has been all about neurodivergency. I think there is a way to do it. And I think a lot of people who are neurotypical and have other protected characteristics will have done a similar thing. And so I wouldn't be scared of using neurodivergency in that way. That's kind of a long-winded answer, but that is probably my advice in terms of kind of talking about neurodivergence in applications and interviews. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I thought it was really good, and hopefully some of our listeners who might be going through the process at the moment will be able to take some of that advice and apply it to their own journey. So thank you for going into that. So I've had discussions with people who are worried about requesting reasonable adjustments because they're concerned that they won't be viewed favourably by graduate recruitment. And I just wondered if you could say something to those people. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it does happen. I can't lie and say that it doesn't. But generally, I've found that getting them to agree to and put in the reasonable adjustments is the hard bit in terms of actually getting them to do things. I haven't found that at the application, that reasonable adjustments and requesting them has been looked down on in and of itself. But in terms of when that does happen, there's a few things that you can do to kind of mitigate the impact of it. So firstly, I think, you have to deal with your own imposter syndrome and confidence issues first, because you have to know that you aren't getting an unfair advantage, this is your legal right and you deserve it and that you are a great applicant. And unfortunately, sometimes you really do have to stand up for yourself during the process. And so it's definitely something to work on first, I think. And then I think there's, that fear of not knowing how to ask, which is often what a lot of people are saying when they say they're worried about it not being viewed favourably. And that's why I set up that template on my website to help people ask, because often it's just about being really firm and clear with them and concise. But sometimes it's not always obvious how to actually ask them. And then kind of the question I would say, and this is my biggest advice to people, is if you ask for reasonable adjustments and they come back to you and say, we don't want you anymore, which I don't think would necessarily happen that often in this day and age. But if it did, do you really want to work for them? I always think that their approach to inclusivity at this stage, as in at the application or even the interview stage, is a good test to see how inclusive they are as a whole. You can talk to people. Interviews are two-way processes. It's also about learning whether you want to work at that firm. And so my main piece of advice there would be to actually, if they aren't inclusive, then good, you found out really early on. You've not had to work for them and you've not had to give 2 years of your life for a training contract at a firm that isn't going to value you. And so I think I would always encourage people to ask for stuff, at least something for them to get by on.
Yeah, and I think that's so important for people to think about. Like, do you want to work somewhere that's not going to be accommodating, because it shouts volumes about how it will actually be when you're in a training contract, and 2 years is a long time to spend with a firm that's just not the right fit. So and like I said, the day.
Yeah, and like I said with mine, obviously the first time around, I could have taken a message from that. I could have taken the hump and said, no, I'm not doing it. But I did provide feedback and they did kind of reform what they did. They were really, really proactive. Everything was put in exactly how I would have imagined it. And so even if it doesn't go right the first time, sometimes afterwards it can still work out for you. And so if you're worried about that kind of thing, just know that firms do take an interest in getting stuff right. They just sometimes don't know how to do it in the correct way, or simple mistakes can be made. And so I wouldn't take kind of, 1 and 1 equals 2 approach. I'd perhaps see first whether you can solve the issue and then kind of make a decision on whether you want to work there. So there's a little bit more to it, but I think generally, yeah, like you say, it's a good way to see whether they are inclusive.
That's a good point. And so what sort of reasonable adjustments can actually help people? I know that extra time is sometimes offered. Is that helpful? It doesn't seem like it would be that helpful in everyone's case. I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, extra time is useful for the majority of neurodivergent people, and that's because a lot of people have either executive dysfunction or they struggle with processing, and that means that they will need longer to kind of absorb the information, or with certain neurodivergent conditions they may need it because it will take them longer to read or write, one of the two. So the thing is, the extra time, I think, is often used as kind of like a token of reasonable adjustments because they don't know any others. And often people ask for it as kind of like a bare minimum because they're concerned, like we talked about in the previous interview question, that they will be looked down upon. There's a really wide range of adjustments that you can request that's still reasonable under the Equality Act. Just to give an example of what I ask for. So I ask for questions in a written format a few minutes before the interview. So I don't need to process those questions on the spot. questions quite direct and concise. Any kind of like social bits, so kind of the introduction and the lunches, if it's in person, I will ask to do that alone. Extra time in the breaks, and also to print off the resources, because sometimes you really have to consider like the small things. And also mitigation for looking back over the case study materials a little bit more, eye contact, occasional slurred speech, etc., because of my verbal dyspraxia. Now, obviously, this will very much depend on what your condition is, and also you as an individual, because you don't need to request what dyslexic Joe Blogs from your assessment centre is asking for. Everyone is different, and it really needs to be kind of a tailored kind of plan for you. And it's quite difficult, I think, to find the balance between mitigation and reasonable adjustments. And unfortunately, it does take quite a lot of trial and error, I've found, and firms aren't always very useful at helping you find that balance. So that's why I kind of came up with the reasonable adjustment table, that is another resource on my website, that looks at, like, it has, I think, over 40 different kind of neurodivergent traits. And then it has the 4 parts of the assessment centre, and then you can just simply look at the examples of reasonable adjustments you could ask for each one. And I also have a table for mitigation, which might be quite useful. But I think just generally have conversations with other neurodivergent people, ask what helps them, try and do practice takes with family or friends, to work out kind of what you struggle with and what can't be mitigated with reasonable adjustments, but will need just kind of like a formal mitigation, like eye contact, is quite useful. But generally, I would say that's my best advice. But yeah, if anyone ever needs any help with that, I'm always available. Or alternatively, try and have a conversation with a recruiter that seems knowledgeable on it, or another neurodivergent person in the firm who might be willing to help you.
The resources that you've mentioned during this episode sound amazing, like the table that you just mentioned and the template for asking for reasonable adjustment. So I'll definitely make sure to link those down in the description box so people can go and check those out. So you mentioned earlier that you achieved a first-class degree in law. So how did you find that experience at university as a neurodiverse student? And what tips would you give neurodiverse students who are currently studying about how they can also excel?
Yeah, I think there's a few things to say here. I mean, if we're talking about my personal experience, I hated it. And that probably sounds melodramatic, but being undiagnosed autistic at university is difficult. And I think most people would also agree with that. I struggled a lot with my mental health. I had what I now realise to be autistic breakdowns and meltdowns and everything quite often. And that really did put me back in terms of kind of like sticking to a regular study routine. But I think the one thing that you have to do as a neurodivergent student is stop trying to do things like everyone else. I used to compare myself to every single neurotypical person in the law school, and think, why am I not working in the same way as them? Why does what works for them not work for me? And I would get burned out. I would go off the grid for a month. And I just realized eventually that you just have to do things in your own way. I learn in a different way. I would hyper-focus on certain topics and not on others. And therefore, a lot of the time, I didn't have a choice necessarily over what I gave my energy to. And so I think you just really have to focus on what works for you, find the techniques and the study techniques that work for you. Don't beat yourself up. If you have to take a week off to look after your mental health, because that is probably going to be one of the most important things. It is for everyone, but particularly neurodivergent people, because they are a lot of the time a bit more susceptible to it due to kind of discrimination and all the other things that we face. But I think, you also have to focus on the positive sides of it. And, you might not be able to do stuff in the same way as other people, but likely you'll come up with alternative ways that might even be better. I can do a whole week's work in a day if I'm hyper-focusing. I'm great at research. I'm great at analytical thinking. I'm really holding on to that is the one thing I think that really got me through. And then again, like I said in the beginning, it's the idea that inconsistency in grading isn't a failure. I still got a first overall, but that's because of an average. And that's because I had some very, very high grades. Like, for example, in some essays, I would get like 89 because I would hyper-focus or have a special interest on that topic. And then other topics, it just couldn't motivate myself through. It really started to impact my mental health when I tried. And so those ones, I either got like a low 2-1 or sometimes 2 2s. But I'm still a Magic Circle trainee, and I think that's the thing to note, that you don't have to perform amazingly across the board on every single thing, particularly when you're neurodivergent, and you can utilize things like the mitigating circumstances box on applications to demonstrate that perhaps there was other things going on at that time which impacted your ability to get high 2-1s in every module, because it just doesn't work. And then finally, I think it's just standing up for yourself and getting what you need. There's things like the DSA, but in my opinion, they only really go so far. Looking after your mental health with things like student counselling, again, only go so far. I think the best thing that you can do is try to kind of work on that internal kind of self-doubt and that internalized ableism as well, because that's quite a big thing for neurodivergent people, that you kind of see it as an unfair advantage. It's not. Utilize things like mitigating circumstances if you need them. It's not weakness. Ask for extra help if you need it. You're not a bad student. You will still succeed. You just need to find a way to get through it. And that might not look like everyone else, like I say, but you'll do it in your own way. I've come out of it extremely proud of how I got through it and how I coped with everything, even though there were times when it probably looked like I wasn't coping. But yeah, just be kind to yourself. Remember you are neurodivergent, you're different, and that's not a bad thing, but it does mean that you have to look after yourself in different ways. That would probably be my top advice. If that was a bit rambly, I don't know.
No, that was brilliant, honestly. So inspiring, and I'm sure that you provided so much tips that you can really implement to those who are neurodivergent at university at the moment. So thank you so much for sharing. And before we let you go, I wondered if you could share where people can connect with you and follow your journey.
So I have a few different platforms that people can use. So I either have my Instagram, which I predominantly post kind of personal insights about what I'm going through, support, kind of like general awareness content and stuff like that. You can reach out to me on Instagram. I occasionally miss stuff because it goes in my message requests, and executive dysfunction means that I lose track of everything. So it might not be the best place to contact me. If you want to get in contact with me specifically, probably my LinkedIn is the best place to go. If you just type in Amelia Platton, you'll find me. I'm always happy to have a chat. I'm always happy to have a virtual coffee to go through stuff with people. And sometimes I think it's just nice to chat to other neurodivergent people who've been through similar things. So I'm always up for that. Like Camilla said, I also have a website, which you can also drop me an email on through that. And that also has our free resources on. But my wider team as well, who you can find on my social media, Instagram even, is always happy to have a chat as well. They're all really lovely. So I would definitely encourage you to get in contact if you need anything. I don't bite.
I'll leave the links again to all of those in the description so people can find them very easily. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our questions, but thank you so much for being a guest on the show. It's been a fantastic episode. You've gone into so much helpful detail. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed my time, and hopefully that was helpful.
Lovely. Okay, and thank you to all of the listeners as well for tuning in. Please do give us a follow on whatever platform that you are using to listen today, and also leave us a review and leave us some comments in the review box and let us know if you found this episode helpful. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye. This episode is sponsored by the University of Law. What really sets the University of Law apart from other universities is its belief that its students should learn in a realistic, professional, and contemporary context. They focus exclusively on practice-based training and give students access to their extensive career service and jobs vacancy database as soon as they accept a place. Through the University of Law's Pro Bono program, law students can hone their skills by working on real cases before they graduate. The University of Law offers a range of postgraduate legal training and master's degrees designed by qualified experts to help students advance at any stage of their career. Their courses are employment-focused, honing key skills in a teaching environment based on real legal practice. Part-time and online study options are also available on many of their courses to help students work and study at the same time. The University of Law will help you reach your ambitions by delivering an outstanding academic and employment-focused experience, honing key skills in a teaching environment based on real legal practice. As soon as you begin your studies with ULaw, you'll learn how to think and act like a lawyer. Whether your aspirations are in law or other fields, their courses will balance academic rigour and practical skills so your career starts from day one. To find out more about the courses they have on offer, just click the link in the description box of the podcast.
To hear more of the Student Lawyers podcast, hit the subscribe button and leave us a star rating and review. If you would like to join The Student Lawyer as a writer, please email hello@thestudentlawyer.com.